There are gestures that change a man's destiny forever, even when they are born from the simplicity of a still young heart. Winter that year came earlier than expected to the arid lands of Arizona. The mountains to the north were already crowned with white when Thomas Mitchell found the boy wandering the dusty streets of Cedar Creek. The boy was no more than 10 years old, thin as a dry branch, with eyes too big for his small face and clothes that looked like they had been sewn for someone much bigger. His bare feet left red footprints on the cold earth, and he carried on his shoulders a grey woolen blanket, patched so many times that it looked more like a mosaic of patchwork held together by necessity. Thomas stopped his horse in front of Martha Collins's boarding house and watched the boy for a few moments. The boy didn't beg, he didn't cry, he just walked with the silent determination of those who learn too early that the world doesn't offer anything for free. There was something about his posture that reminded Thomas of himself many years before, when life had not yet taught him that kindness is a luxury that few can afford. The town of Cedar Creek was no place for orphans. It was one of those communities that sprouted like weeds around the silver mines, full of hard men who measured the value of everything by the weight of gold in their pockets. The wooden houses creaked in the constant wind that came down from the mountains, and the streets were never completely free of the dust that stuck to the skin and lungs of everyone who lived there. Martha Collins stepped out onto the porch when she saw Thomas hesitating in the saddle. She was a middle-aged woman, with hands calloused from work and a look that had seen too much of human nature to even be surprised by anything. She followed Thomas's gaze to the boy and sighed, a sound that was lost in the wind. The boy continued his slow walk down Main Street, past the hardware store, the barber shop, and the salon where men gathered every night to drink and forget the hardships of the day. Some people glanced at him, but no one stopped. At the frontier, everyone carried their own burdens, and few had the strength to share the burden with strangers. As the sun began to tilt to the horizon, painting the sky orange hues that reflected off the distant mountains, the boy found a place to spend the night. It was a sheltered corner between two buildings, where the wind didn't hit so hard, and where a small awning offered some protection from the approaching cold. He wrapped himself in the grey blanket and lay down on the hard earth using his arm as a pillow. Thomas watched it all from afar, sitting on the porch of the boarding house with a cup of coffee in his hands. Martha had offered him dinner, but he had barely touched the food. There was something about that scene that bothered him deeply, a restlessness that grew in his chest like a caged animal. Night fell quickly, as it always did in the desert. The stars emerged one by one, forming constellations that seemed to witness in silence the human dramas that unfolded under their cold light. The wind increased in intensity, bringing with it the smell of snow that was yet to come. It was then that the Indian appeared. He emerged from the shadows like an apparition, staggering down the main street with uncertain steps. He was a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, but his face was marked by hunger and weariness. His traditional clothes were torn, and he shivered visibly in the intensifying cold. Dried blood stained his shirt, suggesting recent injuries, and his eyes desperately searched for somewhere he could find shelter. The few men who were still on the street instinctively moved away. Tension between the settlers and the local tribes was ever present, like a taut thread ready to break at any moment. No one wanted trouble, especially with a wounded Indian who could mean others were nearby. The native stopped in the middle of the street, his body swaying dangerously. He looked around, looking for some sign of compassion in the hard faces that watched him from the shadows. He found none. His legs weakened, and he fell to his knees on the cold earth, his hands shaking uncontrollably. It was at that moment that the orphaned boy rose from his sheltered corner. Thomas felt his heart racing as he saw the boy slowly approach the fallen Indian. The distance between them seemed endless, the boy's every step echoing in the tense silence of the night. Without saying a word, the orphan took the grey blanket off his own shoulders and placed it carefully on the shivering shoulders of the native. It was a simple gesture, almost unimportant to those watching from afar, but Thomas knew he had witnessed something extraordinary. The boy had given his only protection from the cold to a stranger, a man many would consider an enemy. The Indian looked up at the boy, and for a moment that seemed eternal. The two looked at each other in silence. There was gratitude in that look, but also something deeper, a mutual understanding that transcended the barriers of language and culture. The boy helped the native to his feet and guided him to the corner where he had spent the night. Together, they sat leaning against the wooden wall, sharing the small blanket and the heat of their bodies. The orphan, now without his protection, shivered in the cold of the night but showed no regret. There was a serenity on his face that contrasted with the harshness of the world around him. Thomas finished his coffee and rose from his creaking chair. Something had changed that night, something he still couldn't fully comprehend. The boy's gesture had planted a seed in his mind, an idea that would grow and develop in the hours to come. The dawn brought with it a different, heavier silence, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Thomas woke up before dawn, a strange feeling of anticipation coursing through his veins. He quickly dressed and stepped out onto the balcony, where the pale light of dawn was beginning to paint the horizon. It was then that he saw them. 50 warriors on war horses stood in a semicircle around the city, their silhouettes silhouetted against the clearing sky. They were imposing men, with painted faces and weapons that shone in the rising light. They didn't move, they didn't make noise. They just waited with the ancestral patience of someone who knows the value of time. Thomas's heart pounded faster when he understood what was happening. The wounded Indian the boy had helped was no ordinary warrior. From the disposition and number of men who had come to look for him, it was likely that he was someone of great importance to the tribe. The city began to slowly awaken, and soon the first cries of alarm echoed through the streets. Men rushed out of their homes, rifles drawn, faces pale with fear. Women collected the children and locked themselves in their homes, expecting the worst. But the warriors remained motionless, like bronze statues that held millennia-old secrets. Fear has a smell of its own, and that morning it pervaded every corner of Cedar Creek like an invisible mist that stuck to the skin and tightened the throat. Thomas slowly walked down the steps of the boarding house, each step calculated so as not to draw unnecessary attention. Around him, the city was transformed into a cauldron of boiling nerves. Men ran back and forth carrying rifles and ammunition, women whispered prayers behind half-open windows, and children were dragged into the house by hurried hands. Sheriff Jackson, a stout man with a grey mustache, tried to organize an impromptu defense, but his orders were lost in the chaos that engulfed the streets. The 50 warriors stood motionless like rocks carved by time. Their horses, magnificent animals with muscles that undulated under skins painted with sacred symbols, covered the parched ground with their hooves, but their riders maintained the silent discipline of those who understand the power of waiting. Colorful feathers fluttered softly in the morning breeze, and the metal of their weapons caught the first rays of sunlight that spread over the barren landscape. Thomas walked slowly toward the place where he had last seen the boy and the wounded Indian. Her heart pounded in her chest, but it wasn't just fear she felt. There was something else, a mixture of wonder and concern that grew with each step. The orphan's gesture had set in motion a sequence of events that no one could have predicted, and now the entire town would pay the price, for better or worse. He found the two of them still wrapped in the grey blanket, the boy awake but quiet, his big eyes fixed on the movement of the surrounding city. The Indian breathed hard, his skin pale under the faded war paint, but he was conscious. When he saw Thomas approaching, the native tried to get up, but his strength would not allow it. The orphan looked at Thomas with a serenity that did not match his age. There was no fear in his eyes, just a quiet realization that something important was happening. He helped the wounded Indian sit better and adjusted the blanket around his shoulders, a protective gesture that touched the older man's heart deeply. Across the street, Martha Collins watched the scene from her balcony. His hands clung to his apron as if it were a shield against the uncertainty that hung in the air. She had seen many things in her years on the border, but never anything like that. The tension was almost palpable, like the air before a lightning storm. Sheriff Jackson approached with heavy strides, rifle held in calloused hands. He was a man who had learned to read people as others read books, and knew how to recognize danger when he saw it. But there was something about that situation that didn't fit the patterns I knew. The warriors showed no clear hostility, shouted threats or made aggressive gestures. They simply waited, as if waiting for something specific. The sun continued its slow ascent in the cloudless sky, spreading heat over the dry land and making the shadows gradually shorten. The silence between the two groups was deafening, broken only by the creaking of the woods of the houses and the distant noise of restless horses. It was then that one of the warriors stood out from the group. He was a tall, imposing man with long hair intertwined with colorful beads and feathers that danced in the wind. Ancient scars marked his bare chest, telling stories of battles and survival that only he fully knew. Their dark eyes swept the city until they found the figure of the wounded Indian wrapped in the grey blanket. The warrior dismounted with fluid movements and began to walk slowly towards the city center. His bare feet made no noise on the earth, as if he were a shadow gliding over the ground. Every step was measured, deliberate, charged with a dignity that commanded respect even from his enemies. Thomas felt the tension rise around him. Several guns were cocked simultaneously, the metallic sound echoing through the streets like an ominous chorus. Men positioned themselves behind barrels and crates, nervous fingers on triggers, waiting only for a word from the sheriff to begin a bloodbath that no one really wanted. But the warrior continued his approach unhurriedly, his arms relaxed at his sides, making no movement that could be interpreted as a threat. There was something majestic about his posture, a confidence that came from someone used to leading and being obeyed. When he finally stopped, he was only a few meters from the orphaned boy and the wounded Indian. The silence that followed was absolute, as if time itself had stopped to witness that moment. The warrior looked at the wounded young Indian, then at the boy who had helped him, and finally at the grey blanket that covered them. His eyes lingered on the patched fabric, on the coarse seams made of thread of different colors, on the holes that had been carefully closed by small, determined hands. Slowly, the warrior knelt before the two. It was a gesture that surprised everyone present, because men like him did not kneel easily. With careful movements, he touched the wounded Indian's forehead, muttered something in his native tongue, and then turned to the orphaned boy. The boy did not move, showed no fear or surprise. She just looked into the warrior's eyes with the same serenity she had shown the night before. There was a silent communication between them, an exchange of understanding that transcended the barriers of age, culture, and language. The warrior held out one hand and gently touched the boy's shoulder. It was a respectful, almost reverent touch, as if he were touching something sacred. Then, with the same fluidity with which he had approached, he got up and returned to his men. The entire city held its breath as the warrior remounted his horse and raised one hand. For a moment that seemed eternal. Nothing happened. Then, as if obeying an invisible signal, two young warriors dismounted and headed for one of the pack mules that accompanied the group. They came back carrying something that made Thomas widen his eyes in surprise. It was an indigenous blanket, woven with vibrantly colored threads that formed complex and beautiful patterns. The fringes on the edges danced softly in the wind, and the whole fabric radiated an almost magical glow in the sunlight. The stripling warriors approached the orphaned boy with the same respect their leader had shown. One of them held the colorful blanket, while the other carefully helped the boy to his feet. With gentle movements, they wrapped the boy in the new blanket, which was clearly a piece of great cultural value and significance. The wounded Indian smiled for the first time since he had appeared in the city. It was a faint but genuine smile that lit up her face marked by pain and fatigue. He said something in a low voice to the boy, words that no one else could understand, but whose meaning was clear to those who watched. It was an expression of deep gratitude. The warriors helped the wounded Indian to his feet and gently carried him to one of the horses. He was too weak to ride alone, but his companions supported him carefully, ensuring he was safe and comfortable for the journey to come. When everything was ready, the leader of the warriors looked one last time at the orphaned boy, now wrapped in the magnificent colored blanket. There was something about that look that Thomas would never forget, a mixture of respect, gratitude, and recognition that spoke to values deeper than any cultural difference. Slowly, majestically, the 50 warriors began to move away from Cedar Creek. They did not set out in a hurry, but in organized formation, like soldiers who had accomplished an important mission. The sound of his horses' hooves on the dry land created an almost hypnotic rhythm that echoed through the empty streets until it was lost in the distance. The city remained silent long after the last figure disappeared over the horizon. It was as if everyone needed time to process what had just happened, to understand that they had been witnesses to something extraordinary. There are moments that divide a person's life into before and after, and Thomas Mitchell knew he had just witnessed one of them. The weeks that followed the encounter with the warriors transformed Cedar Creek in ways no one could have imagined. The story of the orphan boy and his gesture of kindness spread to the surrounding towns like fire on the dry prairie, carried by travelers and merchants passing through the region. Some told with admiration, others with skepticism, but all recognized that something extraordinary had happened on that winter morning. The boy, now known simply as Samuel to the townspeople, continued his walks through the dusty streets, but he was no longer alone. Martha Collins had insisted that he stay at the boarding house, at least until they found a family willing to adopt him. The colorful Indian blanket he received from the warriors became his most prized possession, but he used it as simply as he had used the patched gray blanket. Thomas watched the boy whenever he could, intrigued by the serenity he radiated from someone so young. Samuel didn't say much, but his actions continued to surprise. He helped Martha with the boarding house chores without being asked, shared her food with the stray dogs of the city, and always had a kind smile for those who crossed her path. It was as if the gesture he had made on that cold night had released a natural goodness that had always been there, just waiting for the right opportunity to manifest itself. The change was not limited to the boy. The city itself began to transform itself in subtle but significant ways. The German baker, known for his avarice, began leaving stale loaves of bread at the back door for anyone who needed it. The widow Henderson began to offer shelter to travelers who could not afford a pension. Small acts of generosity sprouted like flowers in the desert, inspired by the silent example of an orphaned child. But not everyone saw these changes with good eyes. Cornelius Blake, the richest man in Cedar Creek and owner of the largest silver mine in the region, watched it all with increasing irritation. To him, kindness was a sign of weakness, and weakness had no place in a land where only the toughest survived. The orphan boy's growing influence posed a threat to his worldview, a crack in his philosophy that power and money were the only things that really mattered. Blake was a tall, thin man with eyes as cold as winter ice, and a voice that cut through the air like a sharp blade. He had built his fortune by exploiting both the land and the people, and he did not hesitate to use any method necessary to protect his interests. The boy's presence and the change in attitude of the residents began to threaten the control he exercised over the city. One afternoon, when the sun was hanging low on the horizon and painting the mountains golden, Blake decided to act. He called a town hall meeting, claiming they needed to discuss important issues about the future of Cedar Creek. Most of the men of the city attended, curious to hear what the powerful mine owner had to say. Blake climbed onto the small makeshift podium and swept the audience with his piercing gaze. When he spoke, his voice echoed through the wooden walls with the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. He spoke about the dangers of showing weakness to the Indians, about how excessive kindness could be interpreted as an invitation to more trouble. He mentioned the businesses that could be damaged if Cedar Creek gained a reputation as a soft town, and reminded everyone of how many jobs depended on their mines. His words found an echo in some hardened hearts, men who had always seen compassion as an unnecessary luxury, but they also met unexpected resistance. Thomas Mitchell rose from his creaking chair and faced Blake's icy gaze. When he spoke, his voice carried a conviction that surprised even himself. Thomas told the story of that night again, but this time with details that only those who had observed closely could provide. He spoke of the courage of a child who had given his only protection to a stranger, of the dignity of the warriors who could have destroyed the city but chose to honor a gesture of kindness. He reminded those in attendance that true strength came not from hardness of heart, but from the ability to do what was right, even when it came at personal sacrifice. The ensuing debate was intense, dividing the town between those who supported Blake's philosophy and those who had been touched by Samuel's example. Voices rose, fists clenched, and for a moment it seemed that the discussion could escalate into something more violent. It was as if two completely different worldviews were fighting for control of Cedar Creek's soul. Martha Collins, who had remained silent at the back of the hall, finally stood up. His presence immediately drew attention, as everyone respected his wisdom and experience. When she spoke, it was with the firm voice of someone who had raised children and buried a husband, of whom she knew both the harshness and the beauty of life on the frontier. She did not defend either side directly, but told her own story. She talked about the difficult years after her husband's death, when she had thought about closing the boarding house and returning to the east. He mentioned how small gestures of kindness from neighbors had given him the strength to continue, how the generosity of strangers had made his survival possible. And then, looking directly at Blake, he said something that struck a chord with the hearts of everyone present. He said that he had seen rich men die alone and despised, and poor men being mourned for whole cities, that a person's true worth was not measured by the gold he accumulated, but by the good he left in the world, and that if Cedar Creek wanted to be remembered as anything more than just another mining town that flourished and died, it would need to find its soul in something nobler than simple profit. His words created a deep silence in the hall. Blake tried to regain control of the situation, but something had changed in the environment. The seed planted by the gesture of the orphan boy had found fertile soil in the hearts of people who, until then, did not know that they carried within themselves the capacity for so much goodness. The meeting ended without a clear decision, but everyone knew that something fundamental had been discussed. It wasn't just about local politics or business strategy, but the choice between two completely different paths for the community's future. By the time the men left the town hall, night had already fallen over Cedar Creek. The stars shone with particular intensity at that altitude, forming constellations that seemed to silently approve of the events that had unfolded. The air was fresh and clean, carrying the scent of the mountains and the promise of changes to come. Samuel was waiting on the porch of the boarding house when Thomas returned home. The boy was wrapped in his colorful blanket, his eyes fixed on the starry sky, as if he were reading messages written in the very light of the stars. When he saw Thomas approaching, he smiled with that serenity that had become his trademark. They sat together in silence, man and boy bound together by the realization that they had participated in something greater than themselves. Thomas looked at the boy and saw in him something he had long since lost, the ability to believe that small gestures could change the world. In the distance, the mountains rose majestically against the night sky, silent guardians of ancient secrets and witnesses to all the human dramas that unfolded in their shadows. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Thomas knew that warriors who had honored a child's kindness continued their journey, carrying with them the reminder that compassion still existed even in the most arid places on earth. The fate of a city, as well as that of a man, can be decided in a single moment of choosing between what is easy and what is right. Winter came to an end, without anyone really noticing when exactly the last snows melted in the mountains. Spring brought with it changes that went far beyond the weather. Cedar Creek had become something its founders never imagined possible, a community where kindness was seen not as weakness, but as the most powerful force a human being could possess. Samuel remained only an orphan boy, but his presence had planted seeds that were now flourishing throughout the city. The German's bakery became a meeting point for needy families who knew they could count on fresh bread even when money was scarce. Widow Henderson's home housed so many destitute travelers that she had to build an annex in the back. Sheriff Jackson himself had changed his approach, preferring to resolve conflicts with words before resorting to force. Cornelius Blake watched these transformations with growing bitterness. His business had not suffered direct losses, but he felt that he was losing something much more valuable than money: control. People no longer looked at him with the same respectful fear as before. There was a new force in the city, a collective energy that did not depend on his approval or his financial resources. One morning in April, when the air was still carrying the freshness of the mountains but already promised the warmth of the coming summer, Blake made a decision that would change everything. He had received a proposal from a large mining company in the east, interested in buying his land and drastically expanding operations. The offer was too generous to ignore, but it came with one condition: the entire city would have to be evacuated to make way for the new facilities. Blake called another meeting, this time with a cold smile on his lips. When he presented the proposal, he made a point of emphasizing the impressive numbers involved. The amount offered for his land would allow him to buy much better properties in larger cities. For residents, there would be generous financial compensation for the loss of their homes and businesses. The silence that followed was heavy as molten lead. Men who had built their lives on Cedar Creek looked at each other, trying to process the magnitude of what was being proposed. It was not just a change of address, but the complete destruction of the community they had grown to love. Thomas Mitchell was the first to speak, and his voice trembled slightly when he asked about those who had nowhere to go. Blake shrugged with calculated indifference, saying that individual problems could not stand in the way of progress. He mentioned that the company was willing to offer work to some of the younger, healthier men in its other operations, but made it clear that this did not include women, children, or the elderly. Martha Collins stood up again, but this time her posture was different. There was an iron determination in his eyes that made even Blake retreat slightly. She talked about roots, about what it means to build something with your own hands, about the difference between having a place to live and having a home. He asked Blake if he really believed that money could replace the ties that bound these people together. Blake's response was brutal in its simplicity. He said that sentimentality did not build fortunes, that life on the frontier had always been about survival of the fittest, and that those who could not adapt to change would be left behind anyway. His words cut through the air like whippings, leaving deep wounds in the soul of those who heard them. It was then that Samuel entered the hall. The boy had grown a few inches in the months following the encounter with the warriors, but he was still small for his age. He carried the folded, colorful blanket in his arms, as he always did when he went somewhere important. Its silent presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the room, as if a cool breeze had entered through the window. Blake looked at the boy with barely concealed disdain. To him, Samuel represented everything that was wrong with the new spirit of Cedar Creek: weakness masquerading as virtue, unproductive sentimentality, a childish refusal to accept the harsh realities of life. When he spoke, his words were chosen to hurt. He said it was fitting that an orphan with no future should be the symbol of a city that refused to grow. He mentioned that children like Samuel would be the first to suffer when economic reality forced Cedar Creek to confront its own irrelevance. He suggested that perhaps it would be better for everyone if certain people learned their place in the world before life taught them more cruelly. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the men who supported Blake seemed uncomfortable with the harshness of his words. There was a line that was not to be crossed, and attacking an orphaned child clearly crossed that barrier. Samuel did not react with anger or sadness to Blake's words. Instead, he simply approached the most powerful man in Cedar Creek and spread the colorful blanket toward him. It was the same gesture he had made on that cold winter night when he offered his only blanket to a wounded stranger. But this time the meaning was even deeper. Blake looked at the blanket offered, and then at the boy's serene face. For a moment that seemed eternal. Something flashed through his eyes. Perhaps it was a memory of his own childhood, when he still believed that the world could be a better place. Perhaps it was the recognition that he had become exactly the kind of man his younger self would have despised. Or perhaps it was simply the realization that he was facing a goodness so pure that it exposed all the smallness of his own heart. But the moment passed quickly. Blake moved the blanket away with a brusque gesture and turned to the audience, declaring that the argument was over. He said he would give everyone a week to decide whether to accept the compensation offered or whether they would prefer to be evicted when the mining company took over the land. Samuel did not insist. He simply folded the blanket again and left the room with the same quiet dignity with which he had entered. But his gesture had been seen by all, and everyone understood its significance. The boy had offered Blake the same compassion he had offered to the wounded Indian, but this time it had been rejected. The days that followed were tense and full of whispered conversations. Families gathered in their homes to discuss the future. Merchants made desperate calculations, trying to figure out how to start over elsewhere, and elderly people looked up at the mountains that had protected them for so many years, knowing that it might be the last time. But something unexpected began to happen. One by one, families began reaching out to Thomas Mitchell to say they had decided to stay. No matter what Blake or the mining company did, they would not abandon Cedar Creek. They had found something there that was worth more than any financial compensation. They had found a true community. Martha Collins was one of the first to make this decision. He said that he had spent too many years building that life to throw it away because of a man's greed. The German baker struck a deal with a bank in another city to buy the land where his bakery was located. Widow Henderson organized a cooperative among the women of the city to collectively buy the properties they could. Thomas realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, an entire community choosing to fight for its values rather than surrender to economic pressures. The simple gesture of an orphan boy had inspired a quiet revolution, a transformation of ordinary people into heroes of their own stories. Blake tried to resist, using all available legal remedies to force sales, but it found that facing a close-knit community was very different from intimidating, isolated individuals. Lawyers arrived from distant cities to represent residents, journalists came to document Cedar Creek's story, and investors interested in supporting communities like that began to pour. The Eastern Mining Company, facing much greater resistance than expected and bad publicity for trying to destroy an entire city, eventually gave up on the project. Blake, isolated and embittered, finally sold his property and left Cedar Creek for good, taking with him only his fortune and the bitter realization that he had lost something far more valuable. Years later, when travelers asked about the history of Cedar Creek, residents told about the orphan boy who had changed everything with a simple gesture of kindness. Samuel had grown up to be a respected young man in the community, but he never lost the serenity that had characterized him since he was a child. The colorful blanket he received from the warriors remained his most prized possession, not for its material value but for what it represented, proof that small acts of compassion could echo through time and transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Thomas Mitchell, now with gray hair and wrinkles that told stories of a life well lived, still sat on the porch of Martha's boarding house on starry nights. He had learned that true strength came not from toughness or wealth, but from the courage to do what was right, even when the whole world seemed to be going in the opposite direction. Cedar Creek thrived in ways no one had imagined possible. It became known not only for its mines, but for the quality of its people. Merchants traveled from afar knowing they would be treated honestly. Families moved there in search of a community where they could raise their children safely, and young people arrived from other cities attracted by the reputation of a place where kindness was not seen as naivete. And in all these stories of transformation and hope, there was a common element, the memory of an orphan boy who had given his only blanket to a stranger on a cold winter night. It was a simple gesture, almost insignificant to those watching from afar, but who had planted a seed of goodness that would continue to grow for generations. For there are truths that can only be learned in the heart of the desert, under the relentless sun that punishes the just and the unjust alike. One of them is that true strength is not measured by the ability to conquer, but by the willingness to serve. Another is that the smallest gestures, when born of genuine compassion, can move mountains and change destinies. And so, Cedar Creek has stood as living proof that even in the most arid place, goodness can create an oasis where the human soul finds rest and hope. If this story of courage and compassion has touched your heart, you can't miss our upcoming adventures in the American Wild West, where every gesture of kindness can change destinies, and every choice defines the character of men and women who have braved the harshness of the frontier with dignity and hope. Subscribe to the channel and leave your comment below, telling what was the most emotional moment of this story for you. It was when Samuel offered his only blanket to the wounded Indian, when the 50 warriors showed up the next morning, or when the entire community chose to fight for their values against Blake's greed, because each of these moments carries a lesson about the true strength that resides in the human heart.